Tell where it's coming from.
Hi, and welcome back to Purple Collar Life. In today's video, we're talking about tractors, specifically Ford tractors, and we've got in the background here our Ford 8N and Ford Workmaster tractors. You can see I've got some coolant here by the tractor because in today's video, we're talking about tractor overheating, specifically Ford 8N tractors, the signs, symptoms, and solutions for an overheating tractor. This is a 1948 Ford 8N tractor. We've done lots of videos about this tractor. I'll put a playlist up above and down below in the description. But recently, the two Ford 8N tractors that started out here on the family property many years ago were working together to brush hog a big field. And what happens sometimes when that hay gets pretty high is that it starts to overheat the tractor for a number of reasons. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what you can look for to know if your tractor is overheating or not, and then some possible solutions for that. Now, one of the reasons that a tractor overheats when you're brush hogging is because, first of all, it's hard work. These tractors with a 5-foot brush hog behind them are turning a lot of momentum out of that PTO power, and then you have to run the RPMs pretty high to keep the speed up, which means that you're heating the engine up higher because you're running the high RPMs. So you're maintaining high RPMs, working it really hard with the PTO, and as you go through that high grass, it pulls through the front radiator grill, and that sometimes can clog the radiator and cause the engine to overheat. So a couple solutions for that we'll talk about in the video, and then other signs if you're not sure if your tractor's overheating or not, because as you may know, on a Ford 8N tractor, there is no temperature gauge. So stock on the Ford 8N, the early Ford 8Ns had the amp meter and the oil pressure gauge, but the early ones did not have a tach, and the early ones, nor the later ones, never had a temperature gauge. Now it is possible to add a temperature gauge to these tractors. You'd want to make sure you knew what you were doing to do that, but there are kits that allow you to add a temperature gauge to the engine of the Ford 8N tractor. If we compare that to our Ford Workmaster tractor, the Workmaster actually does have a temperature gauge, and it shows you a green section for within operating range and then a red section when it gets too warm. So why is it important to know if your engine is overheating? Well, without that temperature gauge, there's a couple of things you want to watch for, because ultimately you could blow an engine, as they say. So you could do a lot of things that could do potentially long-term damage to the engine. You could even go as far as cracking the block or blowing a cylinder or blowing the head gasket. Those are a lot of things that can happen, worst case scenario, if you overheat a Ford 8N tractor. There are some more minor things that will happen as the tractor overheats, and we'll talk about that later in this video. The Ford 8N tractor does have a liquid-cooled system. There is a radiator. This is the radiator cap. The radiator sits behind the front grille here. There is a water pump that pumps the coolant and water through the engine and through the radiator, and you can see that right here. These radiators do often have a valve to drain them, so you do want to service these from time to time, refill with good clean fluid. The drain on this one is down here at the bottom of the radiator. On some aftermarket ones, you may find that drain clear down underneath, but you do want to, from time to time, service these with the right fluid. Now let's talk a little bit about what fluid goes inside the radiator. I have here a sample of just regular green antifreeze coolant. You want to make sure when you are servicing these antique tractors that you don't use some of the newer antifreeze that have a lot of additives in them. While those may be good for some of the newer cars, they're not great for these old tractors. considering the materials that were used inside the radiators, throughout the water pump, and throughout the engine. So some of the newer antifreezes will hurt the brass and copper that are contained within the tractor's water system. So you want to find just a conventional green antifreeze. I like to use the pre-mixed kind, not because it saves time or energy mixing, but because you know it's exactly 50-50, and the water that's in there is going to be better than water we would get out of our water well or even out of city water. Tap water from water well has a lot of things in it that you may not want pumping through your engine, and then city water has some additives that also aren't good for your engine. So this is nice to get the 50-50 pre-diluted, where they've already got the distilled and clean water mixed in with the antifreeze. I'll put an Amazon link to some basic conventional green antifreeze without all the additives if I can find some, so that Amazon link will be down below in the description. Definitely, if you're buying coolant and you see something that says extended life, that's an example of something you want to avoid. These coolants that have the extended life additives in them are some of the things you want to avoid. So plain green, conventional, old-fashioned coolant. So what are some of the symptoms of the tractor overheating? Well, one of the first things you might notice is that it's struggling. Maybe you'll hear it misfire from time to time, a backfire, and eventually it'll start to miss, and it'll struggle while you're trying to brush hog. So those would be some of the first symptoms you may notice when you're out working hard in the hay field or cutting brush through the woods. The second thing you may notice, most of these tractors have a fan that pulls air through the radiator back across the engine, and you can see your legs would be right here. So you might start to feel noticeably more warm air coming across your legs as the engine gets warmer and warmer. Another thing you might start to see, if you're able to see it, is that the overflow for the radiator might start spraying some fluid down on the ground. Now that's pretty hard to see from the operator station, but if you stop to take a break for a little bit and you take a look under the tractor, you'll see if it's starting to overheat, fluid spraying down here. Now that fluid comes from the overflow just below the radiator cap. So if we were to take this radiator cap off, you would see there's a tube right here, and that's the overflow, and that actually drains down in front of the fan and right here to the right hand side of the fan shroud. You can see the tube sticking out right down here. If the tractor gets really hot, you may even see some steam coming out of the radiator cap, though these replacement caps are often pressurized now with a spring, so they keep a pretty good seal there, but you might still see steam or fluid coming out of the radiator. That's a good sign that you want to stop and give the tractor a break. Now if we take a look at the Ford Workmaster, it's a little bit different hood, so we'd have to open the hood to see in, but it does still have a radiator cap. It's down in here, right in front of the fuel tank, and it does still have an overflow tube. Now ours is right here, and you can see it's not coming out and in front of the radiator anymore. Maybe it was originally, but now it's just kind of broken off, so it's just going to spray fluid out here to the side. Eventually, if the tractor gets way too hot for one reason or another, it will simply shut off or stop working. As I mentioned, since the 488N does not have a temperature gauge, you have to learn to recognize those symptoms of overheating. You need to feel that air on your legs, watch for water coming out of the overflow of the radiator, watch for steam, listen for that misfire or a little bit of a missing, and then as you are familiar with your tractor, you'll know when it's struggling, and you'll kind of get the idea of when it needs a break. Okay, so let's talk about some of the common causes of a tractor overheating. The first one is the coolant level is too low. So when you open the cap on your radiator, you want to be able to see coolant down in there. And you actually want the level to be just at the core of the radiator. So a lot of people think you want to fill it clear up to this overflow mark, and that would actually be too full. And then as soon as the tractor started to get warm, it would automatically send water out that tube, and you'd think you're overheating when you're actually not. So you do need some space in there for the coolant to move around, but where you want to look for is right at the top of that radiator core. That should be right where the fluid level sits. Another thing you want to make sure is that you've maintained that 50-50 mix. It's really important that you have 50% antifreeze and 50% water. What happens sometimes is that you'll see you're a little bit low on fluid, so you'll just top off with some water. A couple issues with that can be if you're just using tap water. We talked earlier about the dangers of both city water and well water in your water system for your tractor. But the second part of that is you may have diluted the coolant below that 50-50 mix. So it's a good idea on a regular basis to check the fluid level, but then also make sure you're maintaining the mix. If you're not sure about the mix, it might be time to go ahead and drain your entire radiator once it's cool, and then refill with a 50-50 blend of coolant and water. The Ford 8N tractor does have these two spots at the top that you can push down, and that will allow your front grille to lower forward to get a better view of the radiator, and you can use that opening to clean this off. I've seen a lot of people take compressed air. As long as your springs are still working here in the grill, it's better to open the grill up like this to give you good clean access to clean this all off. You'll notice on the Ford Workmaster, the grill also opens, but it's a little bit different style. It's got some turn knobs here. And in front of the radiator, this tractor actually has a mesh screen, like a screen door screen, that you can see captures a little bit more of the seeds and debris that you catch when you're brush hogging in a high field. How a radiator works is it's got to pass fluid through all these small channels, and you can see that if they would get clogged with seeds and grass and all that debris, that would prevent the air from flowing through there, and that wouldn't allow the radiator to do its job to cool the tractor. Another potential cause of overheating could be a faulty radiator cap, so you may need to replace that if it is not allowing the spring to compress to let that overpressure come out through the overflow tube. Or it could be a water pump that's not pumping properly, and usually you'll hear squeaking noises and you'll be able to tell that that's not operating properly. Or in this tube between the top of the engine and the radiator, there actually is a thermostat, and those thermostats over time need to be replaced if they stop working properly. They do allow the engine to warm up in cold temperatures, and then they open to allow the water to pass through and cool down through the radiator when the engine starts to get hot. Another thing you want to check is the tension on your fan belt. So this belt should have about 1/2 inch of deflection. So if you push in on it with your finger, it should be able to deflect some. You don't want it so tight that it's got no deflection. But if you've got a lot of slack in it, that means that it could be spinning over top of this pulley, which doesn't let the fan spin as fast as it should, which in turn doesn't pull enough air through the radiator and cool down the engine enough. If we take a look at the Ford Workmaster, you'll see that this belt has a little bit more slack in it than the belt on the Ford 8N. It may be time to replace this. Over time they do stretch out, so you want to check that out. You also want to check the condition of your fan blades, make sure they are still working properly, and that the fan shroud is in place. You can see this has a shroud the whole way around the fan, and that directs the airflow through the radiator and then back towards the engine. See, a lot of times that these shrouds have been removed or have broken away, and that doesn't allow the fan to be as effective at pulling air through the radiator. On the first ever Ford tractor that I had that was a 2N, the fan was actually designed to blow out. And sometimes tractors are designed like that if they are more used for stationary purposes, to blow air out away from the engine. But if you're using a tractor in motion, it's better to have a fan that's directing the air through the radiator with your travel direction and then across the engine. Another thing that can happen if your tractor overheats is something called vapor lock. And to explain what that means, you've got gasoline in a tank just above, in this case, the muffler and the engine, and then you've also got gasoline here in the carburetor. And once the engine gets so warm, gasoline actually starts to vaporize at only about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That starts the process. Now all the way up to about 150 degrees, the gasoline will vaporize more and more and more. And once it gets to about 140, 150, it can cause what's called vapor lock. And that's when the gasoline is actually boiling and it's not able to be pumped through the carburetor. It's not sitting in the tank properly to go down through the filter, the screen filter, and along the fuel line and down to the carburetor. So I brought my heat gun, and this is another thing you can check if your tractor starts not running right. You can use the heat gun to determine the temperature of the bowl of the carburetor as well as the gas tank. And if you start to see that you're above 110, 120, 130 degrees, you'll know that you are in that potential for vapor lock where the tractor won't run. And that could explain why, if your tractor does shut down from overheating and it doesn't restart, that's one of the reasons why you may need to let the entire carburetor cool down, let the fuel tank cool down, so that that gasoline temperature lowers back down to where it's not causing vapors and having that vapor lock issue. So since we've talked about some of the things that can cause overheating, that also will help you determine some of the ways to prevent overheating. Want to make sure your fluid level is right with the right fluid. You're checking that fan belt. Now you know to check the temperature of your fuel tank and the bowl in the carburetor. Another thing you might want to check if your tractor won't restart after being warm. So remember that on these Ford 8N tractors, the distributor is actually in the very front. So it's in one of the warmest sections. In the later Ford 8N tractors, that distributor has been moved to the side, which actually lets it cool down a little bit better. The other thing that can happen is when the radiator overflow starts dispensing water, that water can get pushed by the fan and it can actually push fluid towards the distributor cap on these early Ford 8N tractors. So sometimes you'll get some water or fluid in there and that'll keep the tractor from restarting. It may even be so bad that you might need to take the distributor cap off, dry it off, or let it sit out for a little bit to get all the fluid out of it. Maybe even run a hair dryer across it a few times and then put it back in once you know for sure that it's dry. So if your tractor's not restarting and you've let it cool down for a while, that's one other thing to try, is making sure that the distributor cap is dry. Here on the Ford Workmaster, it's a little bit different electrical system, but the same idea can happen. If your engine gets really hot, this coil can actually overheat and can become faulty. So sometimes if you let it cool down, you can restart, and other times you may actually need to replace it if it's gotten too hot. You can also see the distributor is right here beside that. If you get really hot, you can damage the distributor cap or the points. You can also damage plugs if they get too hot. So if you suspect your tractor overheated and it's still not starting, or if it starts but it's not running right, those are some things to check. You may need to replace plugs or your coil or the distributor or your points to get things running back properly. The same thing here on the 8N tractor. Right in here is where you can see that distributor cap, and right above it is the coil. I'll put links to those things down below in the description. I think I can find all those on Amazon. There are also other really specific plugs that run at the high temperatures you want to run in these tractors, so I'll put a link to those spark plugs down below. So definitely on a hot summer day, when you put these tractors to work, there is the potential that you can work them really hard, especially with something like a brush hog running off the PTO and overheat the tractor. So you want to make sure you do your best not to let the tractor overheat. Watch for those signs and symptoms of the tractor starting to overheat, and then also those solutions, things to do to keep it from overheating. Really regularly, you want to check in here and make sure that the screen is not getting full or the radiator is not getting full when you're going through that high grass. That happens a lot faster than you would think it would, and that kind of starts the domino effect of everything else overheating. So that's one of the things that sometimes even after a pass or two, you might want to get out, get off the tractor, open this up, and make sure that the radiator is clear. If you have other suggestions, make sure you leave those in the comments down below. Help other people out. If you'd like to know more about Ford 8N tractors or Ford tractors in general, again, that playlist is down below in the description. We've made lots of videos about understanding how to start and operate your Ford 8N, how to brush hog, finish mow, how to see how much fuel's in the tank, oil changes, transmission fluid changes. Lots of informative videos for you in that playlist. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll see you again the next time.